Story 1. My younger brother decided to be a train hopper for roughly half the year so he doesn't have to pay for rent. Story 2. I work in emergency medical services and recently had a coworker, who also works part-time at a neighboring fire department, tell us about a coworker they had. This individual moved out of his house and was living at the fire department. They did 24-hour shifts and each employee had a bedroom. This particular employee would just pick up as much overtime as possible, use the bedroom for sleep, the laundry room for his laundry, the kitchen to cook, and the showers. Well, you get the picture. All of his personal items were kept in his truck. This lasted about 4 months before his coworkers noticed. His chief told him it wasn't a bad idea, but that it was time to move back into his own place. Story 3. I remember reading a story about a man who had an internship at some large technology firm, I believe it was Google, in an area with an extremely high cost of living. He bought an old U-Haul and equipped it for living. He parked in the company lot as discreetly as possible and moved every so often. He used the company showers and such. Probably the best way to manage that situation if you could handle it. Story 4. I had a friend who would go to farmers markets and wait until the end of the day. Then they would go up to people and offer to buy the leftovers at a discount. Not terribly exciting, but bold. Story 5. My best friend divorced his spendthrift wife who had gotten them into over $50,000 of credit card debt and wanted to take out a second mortgage on the house to buy herself another car. He ended up with half the debt, of course. But he moved in with his sister and dug himself out after 4 years. He lives alone now and is the most careful person with money I have ever seen. She's being supported by her parents who have her on a strict budget. She's almost 50 now. I shudder to think what will happen when they pass and she inherits. Story 6. It depends on what you mean by the boldest. I'd say the most audacious behavior I have seen was from my former roommate and ex-friend, Sarah, a narcissist and professional mooch. She used her then friends to get a job, a cheap place to live, borrowed furniture, and even food while also quietly stealing from us. I am sure she effectively lowered her cost of living through the theft and manipulation. Story 7. My father-in-law is a contractor. Thus, he has to buy lots of supplies. He buys gift cards first, then buys thousands of dollars worth of supplies on the cards. Also, he can get the gas points. But because he has to buy so much for his business, it adds up hugely. He hasn't paid for gas in years. He also has to drive quite a bit, so it's a big money saver. Simultaneously, the biggest boomer move and the smartest cheating of the system I've ever seen. Story 8. I got sick of continuously rising rents, moving rentals, and working full-time. So I bought a cheap houseboat and anchored it in the middle of the river in my city, closed to everything and totally off-grid. There are no fees to anchor in the river, so besides the cheap cost of the houseboat and a kayak to get to and from, it was free. It was a bit inconvenient, but I did it for 5 years while working 3 to 4 days a week and saved up almost everything I earned. Just bought a house 50% cash a few years ago because of that houseboat stint. Story 9. A student was living in Los Angeles, in an apartment with a rent he could afford but wanted to get a master's degree in engineering from the University of California at Berkeley. Because the Bay Area is one of the areas with the highest cost of living in the United States. The student decided to continue living in Los Angeles instead and flew round trip from Los Angeles International Airport to San Francisco International Airport at least 3 times a week. For the entire academic year, he spent approximately $5,600 on his transportation, roughly equating to $650 a month. Quite an interesting story. He posted the details on a web forum. Story 10. I got sick of paying rent, so I bought an RV and remodeled it to be a perfect bachelor pad. It had a 40-inch TV with surround sound, recliner chair, and room for a stand-up jet ski. I paid someone in East Nashville $200 a month to park in their backyard and use their Wi-Fi. I saved up the rent I would have been paying and put a down payment on a duplex in 2016. It was a good call. Then, I lived in half of the duplex and sold the RV for the same amount that I had invested in it, around $3,000. Story 11. My wife and I eliminated all our grass and converted our front and backyards into a food garden. We only needed to buy vegetables in the winter, but this year we have expanded our planting space so we might be able to freeze more produce. Food is extremely expensive now. Story 12. A friend of mine works as an on-call pharmacist. He goes to rural pharmacies and takes over for a few weeks to a few months when their pharmacist is out. He makes around $60 per hour. His wife works for a big oil company and, based on her job, seems to make a very high wage too. He bought a $1,200 van and put a mattress in it. That's where he lives while he's working so he can pocket the per diem. Story 13. I lived the van life while working as an electrician for C-SPAN on all the Navy boats. I saw my friends spending $1,600 to $2,000 a month on rent. Meanwhile, my rent was $80 for insurance and about $300 in gas a month. My wife and I saved a lot of money doing that for about 2 years. I loved the lifestyle. It's so easy to maintain. We built a 1993 Vandura high top during COVID. We still have the van for camping. It's awesome. Story 14. I've seen one of the episodes of a series featuring the cheapskates, and there's someone who feeds her ex-husband and friends canned tuna, which is for cats because apparently it is cheaper than those sold for humans. Story 15. My neighbors stole my electricity while I was away for a week. I found a poorly buried extension cord running from an external outlet to their house. Story 16. I don't think he did it to lower his cost of living. But a guy I worked with was sleeping in the woods behind the place we worked at. No tent, just a sleeping bag and a tarp. He would sneak into the building really early and use the showers in the mornings he worked. I don't know why he didn't sleep in his car in the parking lot. We later found out the guy had untreated mental illness. He was paranoid about the banks, would cash his entire check and hide any unspent money in his underwear, socks, and shoes, and that he was going to be locked into his apartment and imprisoned forever. Story 17. I was reading today about a German guy who pays 5,888 euros for a Deutsche Bahn yearly travel card rather than rent an apartment. This gives him unlimited travel on the German train network, and he just sleeps on an overnight train every night. Story 18. Finding it really depressing that so many of these are. Living in an actual building is too expensive, so I moved into my car. Like, how did we end up here? Story 19. A guy in Chicago, approximately 15 years ago, had created an apartment under a bridge overpass. He had spliced into electrical and cable connections and everything. Story 20. My older sister had my niece at 18. She used me as daycare for the entirety of her college education. I babysat 8 to 10 hours a day for my sister because she promised when she got her first job, she'd split her first paycheck with me. I was in high school at the time and didn't have a third or fourth period, so I'd watch my niece from around noon until my sister got home. Unfortunately, when I brought up our agreement, she went like Jerry Springer crazy on me and called me everything from entitled to selfish. But hey, she got a good 3 years of free child care from me, and now she's living with an abusive alcoholic, so I can't let her babysit my kids. Story 21. My grandpa was abandoned in a tent with his 2 siblings in Montana during the Great Depression by his German immigrant parents. So I guess I didn't see it, but I saw the repercussions. Grandpa was a bit of an unpleasant person. Story 22. Honestly, probably selling their gorgeous 5-bedroom house to downsize when they absolutely didn't need to. They were doing fine financially, but they basically eliminated having a mortgage by purchasing a smaller home outright with the equity they gained from their first home. It was a pretty impressive move, in my opinion, considering most people are always looking to upgrade. Now, they have no debt and are the only people I know with fairly standard jobs that aren't currently struggling. Story 23. A friend of mine is a lifelong student. Whenever he has to cut hours to go back to school for another degree, he moves into his truck. He has been doing this for maybe 25 years now. He has it all kitted out and drives around the country, doing rock climbing and studying while living in his truck. He has a gym membership for showers and a mobile hotspot for the internet. Totally happy with it. This dude has so much charisma. Watching him flirt with a girl and offer a tour, then come back 40 minutes later with a big dumb grin is insane. When he was more local to me, we'd have him stay occasionally if he got sick or something because I did not want him sick in his truck all by himself. Story 24. This was something I actually did. For a while, I rented an apartment that was being managed by a very incompetent real estate agency. Not only were they incompetent, but also shady as hell. By pure chance, I met someone who previously lived in my apartment and was cheated out of their 3-month deposit. They tried to sue the apartment owner but never managed as he lived abroad and was shielded by the shady real estate company. I was nervous about being screwed like they were once I had to leave the apartment. Luckily for me, the owner decided to sell it and, being the epitome of incompetence, the agency couldn't find my rental contract anywhere to pass on to the new owner. They asked me directly how much rent I was paying and if I could change my rental payments from the old owner's bank account to the new one. Being presented with a golden opportunity, I took the risk and claimed my rent was 200 euros lower than it used to be and promptly paid it to the new owner. No one said anything and I kept paying on time at a discount for some 5 or 6 months. After that period, they started complaining that my rent was too low and ended up requesting an increase of an insane 500 euros, 300 euros more than I was originally paying. I got a lawyer to write them a letter explaining all the ways that that increase was illegal and kept paying at my discounted price. They didn't try to fight back but were not happy. Since my contract was at risk of not being renewed, I graciously allowed them a 100 euro increase, which I guess was enough of a victory for the agency. It stayed like this for a couple more years, and I am still amazed it worked. Story 25. My great-grandparents let my grandmother get married at 17, partially motivated by getting her out of the house because they had 10 kids. She and my grandfather moved about 20 miles away. Her sisters and brothers would come and visit for extended periods, lessening the burden on the great-grandparents. Story 26. Drilled for groundwater wells, invested in solar panels, and started a home garden. They went deep into conservation. Story 27. I can't say I've seen anyone do anything voluntarily. Living out of a car, semi-permanent resident at a campsite, these aren't things you do when things are going well for you. I like the van life idea, but you have to live in the right part of the country because you don't have cheap control of temperature. Many of the cheap routes require a comfortable environment first or it really starts to suck fast. You can certainly make do, but you're making real-life choices at that point. It also helps if the job allows it. Are you in a region or is your travel and work sites conducive to such living? Or are you just sitting in Walmart parking lots all your life? There are very fitting situations. Story 28. The boldest move is generally relocating to somewhere completely different, yet more affordable. You never know if it will work out, and in some ways, it's harder to move back if it doesn't. I've done this, my sister did it too, and so have half of our friends from our home state of California. It worked out for most of us, but not for everyone. Story 29. A college professor and his wife lived in a tent while he built a house. Because he taught full-time and was working on his Doctor of Philosophy, it took many years to build the house in the tropics, full of venomous insects and snakes. But that's the only way they could afford the house they wanted, was to not pay rent for a few years and to build it by his own hands. Story 30. My wife and I got rid of almost all of our stuff, packed the rest into a storage unit, and moved out of our 5,000 square feet house and into a 30-foot travel trailer so she could be a traveling physical therapy assistant. We went from something like 10,000 per month to 5,000 per month. We spend a lot less because there is no space to put stuff, so we don't buy stuff. Story 31. When I was a graduate student in a master's program, I was very close to finishing and didn't want to sign a year-long lease. I slept on a wooden lab table with a sleeping bag and showered at the campus gym. Story 32. A large family, when they would wash clothes in the washing machine, would drain the rinse water into a utility sink. For the next load, they used a submersible pump to pump it back into the washer for the next wash cycle. In other words, they would use the rinse water twice. First to rinse, then to wash the next load. They probably saved 30 to 50 gallons per load. Story 33. My brother rented out every room in his own house and then lived in the laundry room for a year. He had plenty of money and had basically no reason to do this, but he loves money, so I don't know. Story 34. I used to work in many abandoned buildings and houses, and my friend asked me to get him an electric meter from a house. He would wait until after his meter readings were recorded, and then swap out the meter with the one I got for him. He would then swap it back after a couple of weeks. This way, he got 2 to 3 weeks of free electricity every month. He was a wild Korean War veteran, and this method got him extra money for booze every month. Story 35. When I was going to college in New York City, I remember it was discovered that a sophomore New York University student was living in the basement of Bob's library because he couldn't afford housing. Bob's boy was discovered, and the school made him a resident assistant, and I think he became a software engineer and made an app to connect people to affordable housing.